fights off an attempted kidnapper who tried to snatch his child from a store. Take a look. It happened in Miami Beach in the 7400 block of Collins Avenue. Police say.
New at 4, the Aurora Police Department says it's arrested one of the people they say were involved in a kidnapping and torture case at the troubled Edge of Lowry apartment complex.
What if I told you that a single event forever changed a family's life, leaving them to endure unimaginable trauma? On December 4th, 1972, 7-year-old Stephen Stainer was kidnapped, sparking one of the most harrowing stories of survival and tragedy. For 7 long years, Stephen was held captive, abused, and manipulated. But when he finally escaped on March 1st, 1980, it was only the beginning of his battle. Yet, the story didn't end there. Stephen's brother Kerry would later commit horrifying crimes of his own. How did this family's dark journey unfold? Let's dive into this chilling tale. Stephen Stainer's abduction and captivity. December 4th, 1972, a day that would mark the beginning of a nightmare for the Stainer family. 7-year-old Stephen Stainer was on his way home from school in Merced, California, when a man approached him. The stranger, claiming to be a church representative named Vin Edward Murphy, told Stephen he needed help with a donation. But this wasn't a simple request. As Stephen shared where he lived, a car, a white Buick, pulled up. He was kidnapped, unaware that his life would never be the same. The man behind this horrifying act was Kenneth Parnell, a troubled man with a long criminal history. He was joined by Irvin Murphy, a naive and trusting individual who would help Parnell with his disturbing plans. Stephen was taken to a cabin in Cathy's Valley, just 30 minutes away from his family, and kept there against his will, hidden close to his own grandfather's house. For 7 years, Stephen lived in constant fear and abuse. The psychological manipulation began immediately. Parnell told Stephen that his parents had given him legal custody, claiming they didn't want him anymore. He even changed Stephen's name to Dennis Gregory Parnell and enrolled him in school, where he continued the deception. Stephen, though terrified, did what he could to survive. Parnell allowed him to leave the house sometimes, even though Stephen never felt truly free. He could have run away, but without knowing where to go or how to get help, he stayed. It wasn't until March 1st, 1980, that Stephen finally seized an opportunity. At 14 years old, he escaped with a young boy, Timothy White, who had been abducted by Parnell. The two hitchhiked to a nearby police station, where Stephen revealed his true identity, saying, "I know my first name is Stephen." The news spread like wildfire, and after 7 long years, Stephen was reunited with his family. But the journey was far from over. While Stephen's courage made him a hero, the psychological scars and the trauma he faced would haunt him forever. The world had watched as Stephen fought for his freedom, but the real story of survival was just beginning. Kenneth Parnell's criminal history. Kenneth Parnell was a man with a deeply troubling past, marked by a series of criminal activities that would shock the world. Born on September 24th, 1941, Parnell's life was riddled with violence and crime from a very young age. By the time he was just a teenager, he had already started to show signs of troubling behavior. In his early years, he was known for petty crimes, but what followed was much darker. At 20 years old, Parnell lured an 8-year-old boy using a fake police badge he had bought at a thrift store. Posing as an officer, he kidnapped the boy and subjected him to horrific abuse. This act led to his first conviction in 1961, and he was sentenced to 4 years in prison. However, his prison sentence wasn't enough to change his twisted mindset. After serving some time, he escaped from custody, only to be recaptured and forced to finish his sentence. After being released, Parnell continued his criminal activities. By the time he crossed paths with Irvin Murphy, a naive and trusting man, Parnell had already cemented his place as a dangerous individual. Irvin, who worked with Parnell at a resort, became an accomplice in Parnell's most infamous crime, the kidnapping of Stephen Stainer. In December 1972, Parnell and his accomplice abducted 7-year-old Stephen, and held him captive for 7 years. Parnell's captivity of Stephen was marked by psychological manipulation, abuse, and constant moves across California to avoid detection. He changed Stephen's name to Dennis Gregory Parnell and even enrolled him in schools to keep up the appearance of normalcy. Over the years, Parnell would continue his life of crime, using Stephen as a tool to kidnap other young boys. As time passed, Parnell's interest in Stephen waned, and he started searching for new victims. In 1980, Parnell's twisted plans began to unravel. After Stephen escaped and rescued another boy, Timothy White, Parnell was finally arrested and charged with kidnapping. However, the damage had already been done. Parnell was convicted and sentenced to 7 years, but served only 5 years before being released on parole. His crimes would haunt not only the victims, but also the many families whose lives were forever impacted by his depravity. Despite serving his time, the real cost of Parnell's actions is immeasurable, leaving behind a trail of pain, trauma, and broken lives. Timothy White's abduction. What if I told you that one boy's escape led to the rescue of another child, all while the world watched in disbelief? On March 1st, 1980, 14-year-old Stephen Stainer, who had been kidnapped and held captive for 7 years, made a daring escape that would change his life forever. But there's more to the story. While escaping his abductor, Stephen didn't just gain his freedom. He also saved a young boy named Timothy White. Timothy White, just 5 years old, was the latest victim of Kenneth Parnell, the man who had held Stephen captive for years. As Stephen and Timothy escaped from Parnell's custody, they hitchhiked to Ukiah, not knowing how to get to Timothy's home. After searching for hours, Stephen knew they needed help. They stumbled upon a police station, and that's when Stephen made the famous statement that would lead to his rescue. "I know my first name is Stephen." The police quickly recognized Stephen, and the news spread like wildfire. They knew this was the boy who had disappeared in 1972. But what was even more shocking was the revelation that Stephen wasn't the only victim. Timothy White was now free as well. The two boys' incredible escape ended up being the start of a nationwide story, capturing the attention of everyone who had followed Stephen's disappearance for 7 years. The moment made headlines. On March 2nd, 1980, Kenneth Parnell was arrested for his role in both Stephen and Timothy's abductions. Parnell, who had convinced the world that he had legal custody of Stephen, was finally held accountable. Both Stephen and Timothy were reunited with their families, but the trauma they experienced would forever shape their futures. Timothy's abduction was part of a larger, horrifying pattern of kidnapping orchestrated by Parnell, but Stephen's bravery ensured that Timothy was saved. The case became a symbol of resilience, showcasing the power of hope and the unbreakable bond between two boys who had suffered unimaginable horrors together. The murder of Uncle Jess Stainer. In 1990, tragedy struck the Stainer family once again. Cary Stainer, who had already been overshadowed by his brother Stephen's tragic kidnapping, was left to grapple with years of emotional turmoil. But the pain was far from over. Cary moved in with his uncle, Jess Stainer, in an attempt to escape the suffocating weight of his past. However, the peace would be short-lived. In 1990, Jess Stainer was found dead in his home from a single gunshot wound. The case would go unsolved, leaving many to question the circumstances surrounding his death. Despite numerous investigations, the killer was never found, and suspicion remained shrouded in mystery. What made this case even more chilling was the way it was reported. The headline read, "Stephen Stainer's uncle murdered," with no mention of Cary, his brother, who was living with Jesse at the time. Was this just another coincidence, or was there a deeper connection to the family's dark history? While authorities searched for answers, Cary continued to struggle with unresolved anger and neglect. The murder of Jesse remains a haunting part of the Stainer family's tragic story, a story that would eventually lead to far more chilling events. The story of the Stainer family is one filled with heartbreak, trauma, and shocking twists. Stephen's bravery and Carrie's descent into darkness remind us how deep-seated pain can shape lives in unimaginable ways. As we reflect on their journey, let us not forget the real-life struggles that many families endure in silence. Subscribe for more stories that explore the human condition and the darkness that can lurk behind even the most tragic of circumstances.